Hi, folks. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Suzanne Cope. I am a professor at NYU, and I'm also the author of Women of War, the Italian assassins, spies, and couriers who fought the Nazis. And I'm excited to talk to you today about these amazing women. So first, I'm going to give you a little bit of a history. I find that so often, particularly folks in the United States, folks who are coming to World War II history in English, they don't know a lot about this time period, which is why this research was so exciting, because a lot of the sources that I was reading, the stories that I was telling, are being told for the first time in English. So just a quick reminder of where we are. The book, my primary research is taking place from 1943 to the end of the war in Italy. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But what is leading up to this moment is that we have an Italian population that has been under Mussolini's thumb for more than 20 years. When he forced himself into office, for the most part, he made these sweeping changes. His ideology was fascism. He was the original fascist, and so he quickly took over pretty much all aspects of the country, including notably for this story, including education. So the partisans who I'm talking about, and many of the others fighting alongside them, they pretty much grew up under Mussolini's fascism, and they grew up in an education system that was dictated by the government, where they didn't understand a lot of other government structures. They didn't know the history other than primarily what Mussolini wanted to teach them. Also, a lot of forms of a political education and certain books were banned or severely restricted. And so there was just this lack of understanding of the world outside of Italy in a narrative that Italy did not approve of. Also, I'm going to be focusing on the role of the women in the resistance, and women's access to education was also limited. A lot of schools had a limit for how many women that they would accept. Higher education schools, girls were funneled into a different education system that focused on what fascists believed were the role of women, or the role of women should be, being a mother, being a wife. So they were not thought of as being political, and they were not taught, unless they sought out ways to be educated in this restricted system. They weren't really thinking about politics or these more intellectual pursuits. Also, often women and girls and women, they would have to pay more to go to school than boys. And so there are a lot of things that were restricting political thought and just education more broadly in this population. So we have, this environment of these at the time when I start my story, near the end of the war, how these young people were brought up, these young adults. But we also have a country that had been under Mussolini's rule for such a long time, and they were growing weary of it. He really kept rule by squelching all forms of resistance. And so the resistance that did exist was pushed way underground. And if you were caught, trying to organize or do something against the government, you might be sent en confino, which means that they would take political prisoners and send them to an island that was pretty rustic, and these mostly political prisoners would kind of hang out and sometimes make big plans. Also, you might be arrested for your ideas or your actions, and this was mostly these political prisoners were mostly middle class, upper middle class intellectuals. Those who were more working class, there was a lot of economic structures in place where if you were caught organizing, or if you were explicitly thought to be against the fascist government, you could lose your job, you could be arrested, your family would be destitute. So there were a lot of ways that they created a system of compliance during Mussolini's reign. And so he initiated a lot of forms of aggression throughout the 1930s, his second decade in rule, and he aligned himself with Hitler. Hitler actually looked to Mussolini for tips on how to keep a country under control, and so they became partners in a lot of things. And Hitler, when he was moving towards aggressions that turned into World War II, he fully expected Italy and Mussolini to be his ally. And so what happened was he wanted Italy to join them, and even Mussolini's own advisors, who pretty much told Mussolini what he wanted to hear, said Italy is not ready to enter war. but he did anyway. And so this, threw the country into disarray. There was, great poverty. The wartime rationing was very strict. People were losing weight. The food that was available was, maybe way less than 2,000 calories a day, a little over 1,000 calories a day. And so the war was very widely unpopular. And also people didn't believe in what they were fighting for. And so you already had a country that was, primed to revolt in whatever way they could, although they just spent the last 20 years feeling cowed and feeling like they didn't really have a voice. And so when the Allied forces, now with the United States, when they attacked Sicily in the summer of 1943, and then made moves to go to the continent, to the mainland, this was where Italy realized we have had enough. We do not want our country ravaged, as on the front line of war. And so they deposed Mussolini in summer of 1943, and they installed a new leader, General Badoglio, and he was still pretty conservative and also kind of a weak leader. He took a long time negotiating, actually surrendering to the Allies. And so this is a period known as the 45 days because it was 45 days long. And during this period, when they announced that they were no longer part of the Axis and that Mussolini was now arrested, this is when the resistance kind of came out from way deep underground and started to organize. A lot of political prisoners were released. People felt more free to talk. And so there were these kind of old hidden political parties that were coming together. And actually it was very inspiring and I think successful to the movement that multiple political parties realized that the only way they could have strength is by banding together and not fighting. And so they created the CLN, which would be the provisional government through the end of the war that really directed the resistance from the upper levels. And then you also had all of these other groups coming together just to, in small communities and also to organize, in towns and communities and then to stretch their reach between these towns and communities that otherwise felt isolated. So this is over the 45 days, but people don't know what's going to happen because they have said that, the intent seems to be to surrender, but they have not officially surrendered to the Allies. And meanwhile, what's happening is Hitler and the Nazis, they see what is happening and they just stream German Axis troops into Italy. And at the moment, in early September, when it was actually the Allies announced that Italy had surrendered, immediately Germany said, well, guess what? You are not occupied by the Axis forces. And so all of this resistance that had bubbled up during those 45 days was now pushed way underground because, of course, the Nazis were tyrannical. The persecution of Jewish people, while it was happening at a much more tepid level under Mussolini, it was still awful. But he was not actively rounding up Jewish people or sending them to concentration camps. But as soon as the Nazis were in power, that is something that they focused on doing. So if you were a Jewish person, you very quickly realized that you should go into hiding, and many did. More than 80%, I believe, is the statistic of Jewish people who hid at the beginning of the occupation would end up surviving the war. But also, if you were a young Jewish man, you knew very quickly that you needed to go into hiding. Also, they were creating a new fascist army. During this time of upheaval, a lot of the existing Italian army, a lot of them defected if they could because they didn't know what was going on. They didn't want to, be fighting for the Axis anymore, but they also didn't have clear orders of what they were supposed to do. So many of them went into hiding as well. And so as soon as the Mussolini was freed by the Nazis, and then he was put into pretty much a figurehead role of this new Italian government, and but clearly it was the Nazis who were in charge. And so they created a new fascist army with a draft. So any young people as young as 17 were being drafted. And so those young men also very quickly went into hiding. And then another thing that started to happen quickly is that Germany needed more people to create these machines of war. And so they asked for volunteers. They basically, it was a kind of draft almost, where they just said, we need this many men from these areas. And very broadly, the Italians ignored them, and so they just started kidnapping men off the streets. And so if you were a man, particularly in a lot of urban centers, but also in other places, and even a youngish man, there are lots of reasons why you might go into hiding. And so all of these groups of men who went into hiding, they realized, well, are we just going to hide through the end of the war? No, they quickly realized that they should create a partisan army. And so with many of the men, certainly not all, but with many of the men now in hiding, might be, in basements in the city, or in the camps in the mountains, or in old barns, they began finding weapons. Sometimes they would raid Nazi and fascist German or fascist Italian weapons caches. And so they began creating this army. But who would be able to bring them supplies, who would be able to communicate between them? It had to be the women. And so very early on, we have this group of women who had just started to become more politically aware during these 45 days, during these groups that were bubbling up, and people realizing that they needed to be a part of Italy's future. And now we have women who are pressed into service primarily as stafeta. And that just means, simply it means courier, but actually these women as couriers were doing so much more than just traveling, just bringing things from group to group or man to man. First of all, the Nazis, when they realized kind of what was happening, they didn't suspect the women at first, but they did know that these armies and these groups of men were hiding and getting, food or something somehow. And so they made anyone who was helping this men who were in hiding, it was punishable by arrest and or death. If you were caught with underground newspapers, which was another way that they were connecting with people, both with the partisans telling the true stories beyond the propaganda that the fascists and the Germans were putting out, you could be arrested and then eventually punished by death. And so these women who were traveling around, bringing notes, information, helping to plan these different resistance activities, oftentimes carrying weapons, guns, bomb parts. They would then make the bombs and then transport the bombs to places. All of these activities were punishable by death. And so what they were doing, it sounds courier, it sounds like what they were doing was not that, was not that dangerous, but actually was incredibly dangerous. But they were often able to move around both the countryside and the cities because they were not suspected. They were thought of as just, oh, you're a wife, you're a mom. That's all that women, were doing. They weren't thought of as being political people. But of course, they increasingly were. There was also this amazing group. They have a very long Italian name, but shortened as the GDD. And it was basically this first feminist organization. And it was an organization that prompted women to start to come together in these small groups all around occupied Italy. And they would do everything from political education. So women really were learning, for women and girls for the first time, that there were these alternatives to fascism. And education is so important to the resistance. They also had a role within these different partisan camps of called commissar, which was often an educated person. Maybe that person wasn't as strong. I tell in my book about this one young scholar, Jewish scholar, who couldn't keep up with his more strapping fellow partisans, but his job was so important because he was there to educate the men and to keep their morale up. So this was a very important role in the resistance, and both men and women in their respective places took on this role. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 4 women in my book because I chose them because they represent 4 different places in Italy that tells the broader story of the resistance. And also, while they have some common activities that they did to support the resistance, they also were doing unique things that tells you the breadth of what was happening in the resistance, particularly the actions of women. So the first gal that I will talk about is Carla Capponi, and she's on the cover of my book, and also you can see a picture of her here. So she was in Rome. And she, like all of the women actually that I'll be talking about today, Was brought up in an anti-fascist family. This was, something that their family believed in. But for 3 out of the 4 women, their parents found it very dangerous to talk about their political convictions for all the reasons I mentioned a minute ago. And so it wasn't until she was a teenager that she started to realize her father actually was killed in an indirect way. Because of retribution from the fascist government, because he refused to join a fascist group. And so she became more politically activated then. And then during this 45 days, she was asked her home was in a nicer area. She was upper middle class, and she had friends from high school who thought that her home would not be suspected as being a place that the resistance was meeting. And so she began first hosting these resistance meetings. In one scene, she's playing Chopin's nocturnes in the background to kind of dull the conversation so no one could overhear them. But she quickly becomes part of this group, and she becomes very passionate about what she's doing. And she asks to join. She's a stafeta, carrying things around Rome, whatever is needed. And she asked to join the Gappisti, which is a guerrilla warfare group that was being created in that first autumn of 1943 of the occupation. And so this was a group modeled after other guerrilla groups in France and elsewhere, where they would have very small cells that would do these targeted actions. And so at first they reluctantly allowed her because they realized it was handy to have women around because they could act as lovers on the street. They were just cover. And she's like, I want to do more than just be cover. So at first, one of her first actions, she and Rosario, her partner, they were just hanging out as if they were on a date, but really where they were watching the opera, the Roman opera, and they were having a special showing there for a bunch of Nazis, soldiers and officials. And so as soon as the soldiers were coming out of the opera house, they went and they placed bombs on their trucks, and then they ran away, and they ended up creating a number of casualties. But really, their initial goal, the Gappisti, which were active in Rome but also other large cities, was to make the occupiers understand that it was not comfortable for them to be there. They didn't want them to just think that they could, take over their city and not have repercussions. They wanted them to feel like they were always looking over their shoulder, like they had to be worried. And so they did a number of these activities where they would bomb transport trucks. And then Carla became more and more involved because they realized that that these women could be more than cover. She took part in political assassinations and other bombings. And then she famously she played a central role in the biggest bombing, the largest bombing of Nazis in occupied territory, the Via Rosella attack, which made her a prime target. And she was on the run. This was in March of 1944, and she was on the run until Rome was liberated in June. And so she was kind of displays a lot of what the women did as part of these guerrilla organizations. She was one of many. They ended up seeing that these women were really essential to these groups. Then I'll switch to Florence, Firenze, Teresa Mattei. She was a little bit the outlier as far as her upbringing. She was from actually an explicitly known anti-fascist family. And I find it really interesting that these groups, her father, Ugo, he was known to be kind of a rabble-rouser, but anyone who knows anything about the Italian anti-fascist resistance, even prior to the occupation, probably has heard of the Rosselli brothers, of course, of the Ginsburgs. And so that family, the Matteis, were friends with all of these intellectuals. And so, as anyone who might know these stories know that a lot of these intellectuals had to escape, and many of them were killed eventually or died. Under political circumstances. But Ugo was one who kind of was able to stay free for the most part, up until the occupation when he had to go into hiding. So he was allowed to kind of speak his mind a little bit as long as he didn't go too far. And, the Rosellis, for example, and some of his other friends did go too far and ended up paying the price. And so it was this interesting dance of allowing a little bit of dissenting voices. But Teresa was definitely brought up with her siblings of being very politically active. Even prior to the war, she took part in some activities with her family. They weren't found out at the time, but she wrote about them later. They defaced a plaque that was supposed to be celebrating the invasion of Ethiopia. She had a one-person sit-in at her high school in protest of all of this warmongering by Mussolini prior to the war. She also famously got up and left, and this resulted in her expulsion in high school because she didn't like that they were starting to teach eugenics in school, and she's like, "This is against everything we believe in." And her family was actually culturally, or her family was Jewish. They were culturally Catholic, but her mother was Jewish. Her grandmother escaped a pogrom. So this was something she cared very deeply about. In the resistance, she started off also as a stafeta, but then she also was connected to the local Gappisti in Firenze. She did not do quite as much as Carla did, because she was also organizing other groups at the same time, groups of students and groups of women. And so she did a lot of different activities. She also was very highly trusted by the upper level resistance leaders because of her family. And so that was often her role, is to bring the most sensitive messages around and to really help connect these groups that she was organizing with the upper leadership. And so she takes part in a number of bombings, and then also she was instrumental in as the Allies were finally making their way up the boot and liberating parts of southern central Italy. When they reached Firenze in summer of 1944. There was a battle between the partisan army and the Nazis, as the partisans were pushing them out of the city. This didn't happen in Rome, but it did happen in a more ad hoc way in Naples, where they realized the Nazis were trying to steal everything they could. They were trying to destroy the city. They in fact destroyed many buildings and all of the bridges except for the Ponte Vecchio. And so she was instrumental, along with many other women and men, in this battle to push the Nazis out. And so a lot of folks think that the Allies rolled in and they just saved everyone, but really it was this resistance army that was on the front line of pushing the Nazis northward, so that these cities wouldn't be destroyed and many people killed. And so then we're going to move northward. Reggio Emilia. This is maybe less than an hour train ride from Bologna. And this is known as a very revolutionary area. And my gal from there, Anita Malavasi, she is different from the other three ladies because her family was more working class. She tells stories in her testimonies. All of this research that I am telling their stories was from their spoken testimonies or written testimonies or interviews. So everything is taken from their own accounts. And so she started off as a stafeta. The very first thing that she brought to one of her brother's friends, who she ran into when he was in hiding, was just some salt. That was all he wanted. And salt turned into food. It turned into clothing. And then she quickly became part of this really trusted stafeta network where she was bringing guns and bombs. And she got to know these roads because she was going, Reggio Emilia is a pretty small city, and she was going to these bands that were hiding in, small towns and also in the mountains, the Apennine Mountains. And so she was constantly going from the city outward and then back. And she got to know all of these checkpoints so well. She's great and sassy, and also I think speaks to the way that women were underestimated for so long, because she got to know the folks, these soldiers, the fascists and the Germans at these checkpoints, and she would tell these stories about how she would flirt with them, pretend to flip her skirt up a little bit, and they would just let her pass. And as she said in the testimony, stupid fools, they let me go. And she had guns strapped under her dress, or she was well endowed and she would tuck them into her bosom. And so she really brought so many needed things needed resources between the city and to the men in hiding. And then eventually she was suspected of being a partisan once they were actually suspecting women, and so she escaped and joined the men in the mountains, the men that she had been supplying for so long. And so that was the summer of 1943, and she stayed with them until 1944, and she stayed with them until the end of the war. And she became actually a leader of battalions up there, and she would also be they called them the relays. Often women, just like in the cities, and also in the towns, they were thought of as being safe. And so the women would go out and, make sure that the coast was clear if the men were going to an action to raid an arms cache or blow up a bridge to sabotage so the Nazis couldn't get around. And so she would go out and make sure it was safe, and then go back and get the men and move forward. And so she would lead the men into battle, sometimes with a gun, sometimes without. And she tells many harrowing stories about this time as being into the armed resistance. And then last but certainly not least is my gal from Turin, Bianca. And so she was from a family where her father was a lawyer, and also had anti-fascist leanings, but also did not explicitly teach them to her or her sister. And so it wasn't until after his death as well, of natural causes, that she became more politically activated. She also was friends. She was not Jewish, but she was friends with many Jewish people. Her boyfriend was Jewish. She was very good friends with Primo Levi. And so when these racial laws took place, those same ones that Teresa was protesting, that was one of her first protests, where she just, she and her friends, she organized people to go out into the city, and they were saying that Jewish people were not Italian, that they were no longer full citizens. And so she went through and had a protest where they're tearing these propaganda posters from the wall and yelling, "We are all Italian." And so that was kind of her first moment of being activated as part of the resistance. She became a kind of social worker. She actually had a law degree and wanted to be a lawyer, but she couldn't find a job as a lawyer because she was a woman. And so she became a social worker to help support her family. But this gave her access to a lot of the workers at the Fiat plants and other. There's a big manufacturing hub in and around Turin. And so she got to know all of these workers and also got to see their horrible plight. They were not paid enough. They had very long hours. She was working with mostly women who, the men had been killed in battle or were still sent somewhere. And they were getting paid less than men for the same work, even though they were supporting an entire family, sometimes elders as well. There was also extensive bombing because it was an industrial hub. And when they were creating, airplanes and trucks and other things for the Nazis. And so the Allies were bombing them, even though they tried to keep civilian casualties to a minimum. And so it was, it was there that she started to organize the factory workers. And she also was someone who was very instrumental in creating underground newspapers, printing underground newspapers for various populations. She was also among those who were the first organizers of the GDD feminist group. So she was helping to lead feminist women who were, having their first taste of political education. She was spreading writing and publishing these newspapers around that kind of information, which also at a time during the war became, punishable by death. She was also organizing women and male workers through the factories that she was connected with. She ended up being one of the main organizers of the general strike that happened in March of 1944, which was the largest strike in Nazi-occupied territory. Up to 20% of Italians in Nazi-occupied territory went on strike, many in factories, but, in some cases it was farmers would protest and shops were closed and printers even stopped printing the propaganda newspapers. And what they showed was this huge support for the resistance. They were fighting for, more rations, greater pay. The Nazis were disassembling machines and sending them to Germany. They were stealing men off the streets, as I mentioned, but just out of the factories. So they were protesting against all of these things. But once they began protesting, even for these individual or the factory-wide demands, they all realized that they were part of the resistance. And so this was an incredibly important moment in the resistance that Bianca, in her early 20s, helped to organize with mostly women, a majority of women as part of the strikers, because it grew the resistance and it really grew support for the resistance because they realized people had the power. millions of people took part in this, and they were willing to put their life on the line. Thousands would be deported, many would be killed. So this was a very dangerous activity, but it was something that was important to growing the resistance. And also after that, it marks this change in the way that the Nazis, the Axis, understood the resistance. They feared them much more afterwards. It made them more tyrannical, but it also made them more desperate because they did realize that they were losing the war. And that they did not have the power over the Italian people after this. So there were a lot more strikes after this main strike in March of 1944, where the Italian people realized that they could withhold their labor and they would get many of their demands met. So I know my time is coming to an end, and I would love to hear questions from all of you, but I want to end with just a couple ideas. So these women, they represent, just a few stories of, more than 30,000 women who took up arms as part of the resistance. But there were so many more women who, even handing out newspapers or giving donations to this partisan army could have been grounds for their arrest. And so it really took even the folks who felt like they were only giving a little bit, only giving what they could, that was still an essential part of the resistance. Even folks who met and just wanted to learn and have more education, that was an essential part of the resistance. And so I think these are all lessons that we can take away, is that, these Italian women, they did not walk into the resistance, that a movement that was fully formed. They helped create it step by step. And movements like this really are created just by connecting with your neighbor and by doing something that feels maybe a little bit insignificant, but one action, one movement connects with someone else, and it grows the resistance step by step. And so it's amazing that one of the outcomes, the legacy of these women and men, was that when the war ended in spring of 1945, Italy had proven to the Allies that they could govern themselves. They had this government in place, and they were able to not be under Allied rule, which was floated at times because they thought that they would have needed a transition out of fascism. But instead, they had a really strong coalition of multiple parties that were working together. And then they elected women, finally got the right to vote. Few people were voting anyway during fascism, but there were women who were part of the first government, post-fascist government, including Carla Capponi would have an elected official role. And Teresa Mattei actually ended up being the youngest person and one of the women who helped write the Constitution after the war. And so these women really did have a role not only in the war, but in shaping Italy afterwards. All right. Thank you. I couldn't get to all of these stories in our time, but I look forward to taking questions from all of you.
Hi, Suzanne. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Alex and Holly and Max. I'm so excited to be here to answer your questions.
Yeah, it was a great presentation. Is it really cold up there? Are you in New York right now?
I am now well, it's so great for, I'm sure y'all know the system is that Max and your team puts these amazing images behind a pre-recorded presentation. So I've moved from Brooklyn to upstate New York, and yes, we're about ready to get a fair amount of snow again, unfortunately.
Well, the spring is coming. It's going to be a really nice sunny day here in DC.
Oh,
I really
lovely.
enjoyed your book. The cover is fantastic, and I have to say that some of the images that you just showed, particularly the woman at the end with it's like an advertisement for a Milan fashion show. They're wearing Burberry coats. They look so good. I mean, only the Italians could look that good as members of the resistance.
Well, it's interesting. Carla talks a lot about how she would wear her very fashionable trench coat over her outfit, but underneath was a lot of times the same shirt she had been wearing for weeks on end because she was, in deep cover for a lot of this time and wasn't able to change. So at least it made her it hid what might have indicated that she was living underground. So yeah, it served its purpose.
I guess it's cliche to talk about the Italians being really flamboyant and glamorous and looking great as they disrupted fascism. So a broader point, and one that I often think about when we talk about the resistance in Europe, is Italy. Could you make a case that Italy was the one country that was occupied by the Nazis where the partisans and the resistance actually did make a significant contribution to the end of Nazi occupation. I mean, France, you can't say that. Many other countries, you can't say that the partisans or the resistance really made a big impact. Yugoslavia or other the former Yugoslavia and Italy make the case for us in terms of the resistance, in terms of these women being part of a broader movement that actually really did make a big difference.
Well, for one thing, they were fighting for a different future. They didn't want to just get back to who they were before the war. They were fighting for something new. And so what you really saw were people understanding that they were fighting for a new and different life. And it kind of made them I think more engaged than others because when you look at a lot of both in Italy, but we see similar percentages across resistance movements even beyond World War II, is that typically you have kind of, I don't know, 10 or so percent of people who are really active on the say tyrannical side, and 10% or so of people who are really active on the resistance side. And then you have this big swath in the middle of folks who are just maybe they feel one way or another, but they're kind of trying to stay neutral or just live with their life. And so some of these moments that I was talking about, like the general strike, you really brought a much larger percent of people who were moving from that big fat middle towards that resistance side. And it was because they understood everything that was at stake. Not only understanding more and more that their country would now be occupied perhaps by the Allies afterwards, but also understanding even before that, that they really, Mussolini and the fascist government were so unpopular that what is it once they realized that what they might want as a future government after the war, they understood that they needed to be a part of that, and so they were fighting for something very different. And the those publications that I was mentioning, that was a really important part of it because they were not just kind of sharing information that was squelched or kind of rallying people for the cause, but they were also doing this kind of education and bringing people together and saying, listen, if this is the future you want, you need to fight for it. So they were fighting not to just return to where they were, but for something entirely different. So I do think that it was a unique resistance, yeah, certainly during World War II.
So how has I guess quite a few people were overly idealistic in 1945 that they had finally slain the beast of fascism, which is only, by 1945 is like 25 years old. But it obviously is a virus that has morphed. It's shifted and changed. The historian Ian Kershaw talks about how it's impossible to define fascism. But we see it in the world today. It's in different forms. It's a very adaptive virus. I mean, what's the lesson from your book about how we can combat fascism today?
Well, as far as joining a movement and feeling like you're part of something, I felt this way myself a yearish or so ago, where I was like, "Oh my God, what do I do?" I felt like I had to make some sort of big, bold move, and really, it was this metaphorically start with salt, start with your community, start with something small. So I think that's the literal first step that so many people can do if they really feel moved to be part of creating change. But one thing, I purposely did not focus too much on post-war because it is very complicated. But of course, I do, understand what happened after the war and think it's really important to kind of learn some lessons from that. And one thing that other historians who know a lot more about this, and even folks at the time, such as Natalia Ginsburg, who was part of a couple with her husband Leon, who were both actively anti-fascist. During Mussolini's reign, during the war, her husband was killed for being anti-fascist. She wrote afterwards this great essay that I even use with my students at NYU, about how the Italians they really wanted to put this period of their life behind them. And they're just like, let's just forget about this. Let's just move on. And it was this lack of really dealing with their fascist past, because even though yes, there were many ways that, the most ardent fascists were really squelching resistance. There were a lot of people too who just went along with it and didn't resist. And there was certainly more that folks possibly could have done, even though it might have put them in great danger. And it was a willingness afterwards that that many folks talk about, to just say, all right, let's just forget the past and move on. And by not dealing with this past, not reconciling with it, even people like Natalia in the very years after the war were kind of ringing this alarm bell of saying we need to recognize the past and try to actively eliminate it. Um, that's what folks now are saying is why fascism, I mean, we know that Italy has a pretty far right government at the moment, even though a lot of people feel differently. But it was this lack of really dealing with that, reconciling with that past, and moving forward. Because a lot of folks said, "Well, oh, Mussolini wasn't as bad as Hitler." So it was this feeling that they didn't have as much to atone for, but certainly they had plenty to atone for that really wasn't dealt with immediately after the war.
Well, you could argue that the Germans were just much better at fascism. They stole it. They were inspired by it, and Hitler gave it a special spin with it, which was a particularly murderous spin. But anyway, we have quite a few questions, a lot of questions actually. So I'm going to rifle through them. I hope you don't mind trying to answer as many as possible.
Yeah, let's
That
go
is
for
the
it.
reason why. Apart from banging on about various things, that's what I'm here for. But anyway, so Thomas asks, how were these women received after the war, especially given their ties to communist partisan networks during the early Cold War? Great question.
Well, my next project is looking at the 1930s in the United States and thinking about how communism was perceived of then. And it was directly influenced by what I was learning about communism and how it was conceived of during the war as well. It was to many Italians, communism was very idealistic. I mean, we didn't know the reality of what was happening in Russia, and so they were not vilified. Really, communism is still, and even to today, we still have a relatively active and not vilified communist party and communist ideology in Italy and elsewhere. So the way that we think about communism in the United States is very different than it's thought of elsewhere. But after the war, more broadly, what was really great about this coalition is that there were five major parties that came together to create this provisional government, and so they were very open to having all of these ideologies across, center to left, we'll say, of having them all represented and having robust political debate. And so that was very exciting that they created this government with a lot of, I say multi-partisan, contribution and respect. But the women more broadly were left out of the partisan conversation immediately after the war. They were thought of as being, if they were someone like almost any of these women, actually, they might not make it home before curfew, and so they would be spending the night with men, and that was considered absolutely taboo. And so someone, especially like the folks who were in the partisan armies, they were like, you were living with men in sin. And so when they were walking, if they did join these parades, which many of them did not, they were not welcome to, they were judged. They were thought of being, hussies. And so I was at first very outraged, and I still am outraged, but for different reasons. In the beginning, I was like, why didn't they let these women join these victory parades when they were so much a part of it? And then it was actually not until I was writing the very end of the book, my epilogue, and I note this in my epilogue, that actually it was considered kind of a protection where a lot of some of the men, because by and large the women, there are of course outliers, but by and large the women, all the stories of the women I write about in the book, but also women whose stories I read beyond that, said that they were mostly very well respected by the men that they worked with, and uh, and so these men were protecting them because they knew that they would be judged. And a lot of times, women who were not part of, say, the medic team, the Red Cross, maybe would put the medic band on, and pretend that they were nurses so that they could walk in these parades, because that was kind of the only recognized or allowed role for women. And so it wasn't until years later, and there was a couple different waves of capturing these women's stories, that their true involvement was more widely known and more widely not just accepted but celebrated. And so, yeah, they were not, they were not praised and celebrated as much as the men immediately after the war.
Uh, Thank you. We have a comment from David. My dad loved to tell me about a classmate Perry Pickett. He was shot down over Italy. He escaped and was recaptured at least twice. He could never get back to the Allies, so he went into the mountains and joined the resistance. He later became mayor of Midland, Texas. So there are loads of stories about American airmen in particular joining the partisans, joining the Italian resistance. Can you tell us, describe the Italian resistance in the mountains to the north of Italy? What kind of organizations would you expect to be helped by, rescued by, even join in, let's say, late 44, 40 into 45?
Yeah, so certainly there are so many stories of Allied soldiers who, yeah, exactly this. They were shot down, or they were in some way, they were exposed, they were separated from their groups, and they were helped both by, individuals. Maybe they were brought in by just families, or, and typically it would be women who helped to disguise them or helped to move them to a safe place. A lot of times, because these groups in the mountains are, hiding underground in various ways, were kind of solidified in their camps. They might join them variously. And so, yeah, it was, I didn't come across, at least in these four women, a lot of robust stories about foreigners that were part of them, but I did, more broadly I don't have details of that, but I do more broadly in passing, that they would take in anyone who wanted to help them out. And sometimes they helped get them back, if they were close to the front line, they might help them get back over the front line in the opposite direction. But what was interesting was there was a lot of, in the beginning of, this 1943 to 1945 timeframe that I'm looking at, there was a lot of skepticism by the Allied forces, of the partisans. And, understandably so, I think, because they were the enemy for a very long time. And so they didn't know if they could trust them. And so once they realized that they really were, all fighting for the same cause, and there's a lot of reports even from some of the things I read that were German Nazi, um, different reports or whatever, that they were just as afraid. They were similarly afraid of partisan, bombs, or partisan, they might attack them when they were on the road to somewhere, as they were of Allied aerial bombings. And so you began to see, both the Allies saw this, but also the Nazis saw this, that they were a formidable enemy. And so that was when the Allies started to drop, give them more support, because these partisan bands were really working with, I mean, they pretty quickly began to steal things from the Nazis and the fascists. So they would find arms caches and they would steal those, or they would try and find some other resources. But for the most part, they were relying on what mostly women could bring them, and what sympathetic Italians could bring them. And then finally they started to have drops of supplies. But even then, they often would complain. They're like, you send us this big crate, but half of it was padded out with sandbags. Why didn't you just throw in some old uniforms or something? A lot of times these folks who were in hiding, they had one outfit, and it wasn't even appropriate for the weather. They would also send them some money, because of course they needed money. And so the Allies began to send them more and began to rely on them. Also, there's a number of stories of Allied spies, and they had a robust network of passing information. I talk about Radio Cora. That was probably the most famous story of this, where they were in Florence, and they had this very active and very important group that was helping the Allies move forward to Tuscany area. And they were eventually found out, but only after greatly helping the cause. But also around the landing of Anzio, there were also important connections being made by Allies who were in hiding, and facilitating that radio network. And so those are mostly the stories that I cover. But what is really exciting is that as I've been talking about this book to folks, I find that there's so many, Americans, because I've been in mostly the Northeast in particular, who are saying this is the first time that I truly understand any sense of what my family member, who was, part of the U.S. Army and generally, or U.S. Armed Forces, part of what they were dealing with, and who helped them. These stories are just so rarely told, except anecdotally. And so I'm really excited, even though I don't focus on that, to be able to give some sort of context of what was happening with the resistance. And I'll say the resistance, and also sympathetic folks who maybe didn't think of themselves as part of the resistance, but even by helping Allied soldiers, certainly were part of the resistance.
Well, Suzanne, you've done a fantastic job. I really enjoyed this. I love the way that you blended in the personal with the bigger strategic and military picture. It's very well done, very inspiring. What are you going to work on next? What's your next book again? Remind us.
Well, I am waiting for the green light from the publishers, but the time period that I'm very interested in is 1930s US, 1930s New York, kind of the prequel to World War II, and thinking about activist New York. And I'm zeroing in on some folks that I think could really help tell this story as Nazism is fomenting, Spanish Civil War is active, and folks are really raising the alarm in the United States of we need to battle Mussolini. He's invading Ethiopia. We need to stop the rise of Hitler. What was happening here and how that was influenced by what was happening globally. And of course, they were prescient. They saw that World War II could possibly happen if we didn't stop them. And in fact, those folks were correct.
That's a great idea. Without going too off the topic, I'm reading a book by is it Jonathan Alter, The First 100 Days, about when the first 100 days of Roosevelt's first presidency.
Yes.
And I would say that if anybody wants to see why Roosevelt is the most important politician of the 20th century, the most important American politician, I mean, the calls from people on left and right, you name it, in America in 1933 at the height of the Depression, when the US economy was collapsing, when the banks were basically falling apart in front of our eyes, the call was universal. It was like, we need a strong man. We need an
Mm.
authoritarian. Roosevelt, you have to be our Hitler, basically. I mean, Hitler was elected around about the same time. And yet, the great lesson of American political culture is that you're not supposed to be an authoritarian. Presidents are not kings. Washington refused a regal position. That's the whole point of American democracy: is that it's a balance of power, a separation of power, and thank God we had individuals that rose to the moment.
No, exactly.
Namely
And
Roosevelt.
that's
Namely Roosevelt.
that's
I will not
exactly
be
the
in a room.
story.
I will not be in a room with anybody that wants to have an argument about how important Roosevelt is to this country's salvation. I mean, it's just extraordinary. The more you look at Roosevelt, the more you have to thank him for everything we have today. Anyway, I loved your presentation. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you
Sorry to
so
go on
much.
that rant about how important it is to appreciate the right kind of president, but I will. And we'll
Well, y'all stay tuned in a couple years for that book because I agree.
Great.
It's a very compelling decade. Yeah.
Thank you, Suzanne. Have a wonderful weekend.